Let's just dive right into this explainer, shall we? Today, we're tackling one of the oldest, most profound, and, let's be honest, most difficult philosophical puzzles in human history. We're looking at that massive inherent tension between the idea of a supposedly good, all-powerful creator and a world that is just undeniably filled with pain and suffering. It really all boils down to one fundamental question. If there's a God of love, why is there so much pain and suffering? This single question validates a very real, very deeply felt human doubt. And as our source material points out, it's actually the primary reason a lot of people today identify as atheists or step away from the traditional Judeo-Christian concept of God. It's not just some abstract academic exercise, right? It's a deeply personal human dilemma. Now, what's super interesting here is the specific vocabulary of disbelief. We tend to just throw around the word atheist for everything, but look at these distinctions. You've got dystheism. That's the belief that God exists, but just isn't completely good. Then there's sadotheism, the idea that God is actively malevolent. Deism suggests a totally unconcerned creator. Mesotheism is the actual hatred of God, and antitheism is the active opposition to belief itself. So our sources are highlighting something crucial here. The problem of evil isn't just a broad challenge to the general idea of a higher power. It's a very specific, direct challenge to the existence of an all-knowing, completely good God. To really understand this critique properly, we need to look at the absolute strongest version of it. And for that, we turn to the renowned British philosopher Bertrand Russell. Russell took this exact problem of suffering and used it to launch a masterful, incredibly influential intellectual attack aimed specifically at Christianity and traditional theism. He didn't just casually ask the question, he literally sharpened it into a weapon of logic. He posed this incredibly piercing question. He asked, "Do you think that if you were granted omnipotence and omniscience and millions of years to perfect your world, you could produce nothing better than the Ku Klux Klan and the fascists?" Wow. So the absolute core of Russell's argument is this devastatingly logical assertion. Either God lacks the power to stop evil, meaning he isn't all-powerful, or he lacks the goodness to want to stop it. Therefore, according to Russell's logic, a perfect God simply cannot exist. Now, at first glance, Russell's logic seems completely irrefutable, doesn't it? It feels like a total intellectual checkmate. But, well, the philosophical debate doesn't end there. Let's look at the first major response to this challenge, which centers on something we humans really don't like to admit: the sheer, staggering scale of our own limitations. When we actually map out the energy distribution of the universe, it becomes visually obvious really fast that our vantage point is impossibly tiny. The vast majority of reality, stuff like dark matter and dark energy, is entirely unknown to us. Only a tiny, tiny sliver, about 4.6%, represents absolutely everything we can even observe, let alone actually comprehend. To put that into perspective, our source material notes that even if we took the knowledge of the smartest anti-theist in the world, say someone like Richard Dawkins, and mathematically magnified that intelligence billions of times over, it would still be just a microscopic fraction of all existence. We're essentially trying to inspect the entire cosmos through a remarkably small magnifying glass. And that leads us to a pretty profound realization. If an infinitely wise creator does exist, a being capable of conceptualizing and breathing a whole universe into existence out of absolutely nothing, it really shouldn't surprise us that we might fail to grasp his complex purposes. Honestly, we're basically a dust speck screaming out our own significance into the void. This perspective brings up a pretty hard truth. Declaring that God definitively does not exist simply because we can't understand his methods or his timeline, well, that might just be an act of monumental human arrogance. It operates on the assumption that if a reason exists, our human brains must be inherently capable of fully understanding it right this second. Think of it this way, kind of like how Jordan Peterson points it out. An infinite foundation of reality wouldn't just be, another object in the room whose motives we can easily cross-examine like a witness on the stand. We're trying to categorize something that exists entirely outside of our boundaries of time and space. Okay, but what if we approach Russell's argument from a completely different angle? In philosophy, there's this classic rule of logic. If an argument seems flawless, but the conclusion is highly contested, you check the hidden premises. So let's do a little pivot here and look at what Bertrand Russell was assuming without actually saying it out loud. It turns out Russell's entire critique relies heavily on two massive, completely unstated assumptions. First, that the human race inherently deserves a better world than the one we currently have. And second, that God is therefore unjust to withhold that better world from us.
Essentially, he's assuming profound human innocence while simultaneously demanding cosmic justice. And here is the stark turning point of this entire line of thought. If Russell is right, and there is absolutely no divine creator to blame for the flawed condition of the world, then whose fault is it? Who exactly do we blame for the atrocities of human history?
Because subtracting God from the equation makes all the evil in the world entirely our own fault. It completely forces us to look in the mirror and ask a really uncomfortable question. Does a human race capable of producing such terror, the very Ku Klux Klan and fascists that Russell himself pointed out, actually deserve a perfect pain-free world?
But wait, there's a third response we need to consider. Even if we fully accept the crushing reality of evil and suffering, Russell's logical argument actually falls significantly short of completely disproving the Judeo-Christian God. Sure, it points out a severe tension, absolutely, but it definitely doesn't close the case.
And why is that? Well, because the presence of suffering doesn't necessarily prove God's absence. In fact, ironically, it actually aligns perfectly with ancient scriptures. Texts like Isaiah have explicitly claimed for millennia that divine logic is incomprehensibly higher than human logic. The text practically promises us that we won't fully understand how God operates. So finding God incomprehensible doesn't actually disprove him, it oddly matches the historical description of him perfectly. Which brings us to the final, really fascinating alternative worldview presented in our source material. What if we look at a framework that doesn't just try to excuse pain, but actually expects the world to be filled with it? Dating all the way back to the oldest text in the Bible, the Book of Job, this perspective views reality as an active, ongoing war zone. It introduces the concept of a Satan, an adversary actively opposing the good. Under this spiritual warfare worldview, the reason the world looks like a chaotic battlefield strewn with casualties is actually very simple, because it literally is one. The renowned author C.S. Lewis powerfully championed this idea. He argued that our modern, quote-unquote, enlightened disbelief in a personal, intelligent force of evil isn't intellectual progress at all. Instead, he saw it as a dangerous vulnerability that just gives evil the perfect cover to operate completely unseen. And Lewis approached this supernatural concept incredibly logically. He defined this adversary not as some equal, opposite rival deity to God, which is a super common misconception, by the way. Instead, he described evil as a limited, parasitic creature. It has zero originality, it just corrupts and distorts what is already good, and it operates with a strictly limited intelligence. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, incredibly provocative thought to ponder. If you remove the villain from the story just doesn't make sense. Does the chaotic, often incredibly painful human experience only finally come into focus when we are willing to acknowledge that there's an active villain in the narrative? It's definitely a perspective that reframes this entire ancient debate.